All right, so in the previous video, I talked about God's essence and his existence, and how if God is the type of thing that necessarily exists, and he is, and there must be something that is the type of thing that necessarily exists, right? Otherwise, nothing would have existence, and something certainly does exist. Well, if that's the case, then we are going to have this big worry about, then if God's essence is his existence, and I exist, does that mean that I'm God? That's certainly blasphemous, right? Does that mean that anything that exists is God somehow? And that's no good. We don't want to end up affirming something like that. And we know that something, because of divine revelation, is just patently false. And it's not only false, it's one of the major sins that occurs constantly throughout Scripture, is people ultimately trying to affirm that they are their own gods. And so that's not going to do. And so what we end up doing is we recognize that when we talk about God, we do so analogically. Now let's talk about what analogically means affirmatively and negatively. First off, sometimes people take the analogy of being to mean that we can't talk about God at all. This would be apophaticism. This was affirmed kind of by Plato, but definitely by Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonic thinker who influences Augustine a lot, as we're going to see later when we go through the Confessions. But he is certainly not a Christian thinker, not in himself. Christians will use Plotinus in interesting ways during the 7th and 8th centuries, but they're not wanting to just completely recycle the work that he's saying. And I think to do so would be a fundamental mistake, right? Plotinus is not a Christian theologian in himself. He's got you have to work with some of his concepts in that. He's wanting to affirm something like apophaticism, which would say we can't say anything about God. Now, this is an indefensible view for the following reasons. If I can't say something about God, that means that I can't say that I can't say something about God. For to do so would be to say something about God. Therefore, it can't be that I can't say something about God. I might have missed a negative in there, but you get the idea. If you're going to affirm apophaticism, you have to reject apophaticism, and thus it is self-refuting, understood from a simplistic point of view. Now we might say, yes, maybe that's true, that it's self-refuting, but we still want to be very careful when we talk about God, because we want to recognize that our human intellect is finite and limited, and also marred by sin. So we're not going to be able to say anything and everything about God, and we might even really struggle to say most things about God. Okay, that's one side of things. The other side of things, though, is the person that has a lot of confidence that everything we can mean when we refer to God tracks on perfectly, right? When I talk about what it means for me to be good, that's exactly what it means for God to be good. When I talk about what it means for me to be knowledgeable, that's exactly what it means for God to be knowledgeable, except that God is just to a much higher degree, an infinite degree, and that's the only difference. So maybe we could have something like what's considered to be a perfect being theology. We're just going to say, if a perfect being exists, this has to be how it is, because that's just what it means for something to be a perfect being, and God is a perfect being. You can use perfect being theology in interesting ways, and certainly St. Anselm, I would say, does that, but that's not going to be the primary mode that we end up actually exploring who God is in this course, at least not right here. I'm very skeptical of perfect being theology because of this exact reason. It seems to require that you can track on to God at a one-to-one rate in the sense that we would track on to us. And I would say we need to be a little bit more humble in the words, in what we say about God. And it could go something like this. We've already talked about the difference between accidents and substances. Accidents are the things that adhere in something else, and substances are the things that can exist in and of themselves. Or at least it's a loose definition. I would end up modifying that a little bit, as you may have seen in some of my other writings, the stuff that you read this summer. But it's a pretty good definition to start out to get the gist of it. Now, the accidents of the wall behind me are the grayness of the wall. The substance is the wall itself. Now, just because the wall itself exists in and of itself doesn't mean that it's not in some sense dependent on other things, right? It's dependent on the ground. But it's not the type of thing that actually, I could imagine that God created only one thing, and that one thing was the wall, right? Now, if he was to do so, of course, as we already know, he would have had to have created multiple things, at least in reality, he would have had to have created material, which can be divisible. He would have had to create form. He would have had to create existence and essence as two separate things. So there's a multiplicity, even if he was to create the wall. But let's just say that he does that. He creates only the wall, so only the wall is the type of thing that can exist. There, so long as God is allowing the wall to continue to exist, then there's nothing that would stop the wall from being able to exist in and of itself. It's not like grayness or the grayness of the wall, which needs something to attach to. The wall could simply just be there, right? Again, so long as it continues to participate in existence in and through God. And so we would say that when I say the grayness of the wall is present and the wall is present, I am using the copula of those terms, the word is, analogically. It is something different for the grayness behind me to exist than it is for the wall behind me to exist. That backwards E, again, remember, existence is different in those instances. Okay? They're analogically related. In other words, they're related by way of analogy. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't say anything about them. Indeed, for the gray wall to exist, or for the grayness of the wall to exist, and for the wall itself to exist, that's more alike than it is unalike, or it's more similar than it is dissimilar. But it's not exactly identical. And so similarly, as we talked about in the previous classes, and as we talked about in the previous video, God's being is distinct from our being. In that we exist, I should say God's essence is distinct from our essence, in that we exist contingently. It could have been that we didn't exist. There is nothing required by our essence or what we are, namely human animals, human beings. There is nothing in that would require us to exist. But in God's very nature itself, he must exist. Okay? We exist contingently, God exists necessarily. This means that in the same way that we could talk about the accidents of the wall, the grayness, the perspicuity of it, the imperspicuity of it, I'm using the word that I'm going to use a little later. Don't worry about that. The grayness or the translusiveness of it, or the lack thereof, or something like that. That is going to be different from the wall's existence itself. And similarly, because we exist contingently, our existence is a different type of existence than God's existence. What that doesn't mean is that doesn't mean we can't talk about God at all. Or, to put that in positive terms, we can talk about God analogically. We can talk about God by way of analogy, but that way of analogy has its limits. Conversely, that's not to say that everything we say tracks on perfectly to the nature of God, but it is also not to say that we're strict apophaticists, where we say we can't really say anything about God. No, I can actually say this, and this very clearly. God exists. But when we say God exists, we mean existence in such a way that it is included in his nature. So it's a different type of existence than the existence that we have, in virtue of it being necessary existence. Existence that could not have been otherwise, because it is found in the very definition of what it means to be God. That's of paramount importance for understanding Thomas Aquinas on this. And it's going to be one of the most hotly debated themes of medieval philosophy and theology, one which I generally actually side with Aquinas on, too. I've had my doubts in the past, because my worry sometimes is that, well, if we can only speak about God analogically, do any of the words that we actually say track on? And I think this way of talking about the difference between the grayness of the wall itself, a necessary being and an unnecessary being, or a contingent being, this is quite important to make sure that we're understanding Aquinas in a way that is helpful, and I think that he's right about this. And indeed, if you deny this sort of thinking, this analogia entes, or this analogy of being, I think one of the biggest problems that ends up cropping up is that you either try to obliterate all Christian mystery by simply saying that we can just understand it fully, or you end up towards apophaticism, where we say we can't understand it at all. And the analogy of being gives us a middle road to carve out and say we can definitively say things about God, so long as we understand where our language and where our intellect is going to fail. That's very important. And as we'll see later on, this will also be important for understanding things like divine simplicity and things like understanding God's intellect and his will and some of its attributes such as omnipotency and omnibenevolence and the like. So get excited for that. Hopefully this overview helps. You're welcome to review it a couple times if you need to, or just come by class and talk with me about it again. This is certainly one of the more contestable theses of this class, but one which I think that there's pretty good biblical, theological, and historical reasons to actually affirm. So I hope you enjoyed.